Paola, a very warm welcome to you. I heard about you quite recently. You were on a segment on the Today programme on Radio 4. My camera's suddenly done a nice sort of soft focus on me. See if I can... Sorry, I'm going to have to switch it off and on again. I don't know if it's giving me a message.
I wish it would do it to me.
It's like, you're looking old, Tom. We're going to blur you. So where are we at? I heard you on Radio 4 the other morning introducing your book, and I'm immediately fascinated. I was on the texting to Duncan straight away. Lovely. If you could introduce yourself and your book as well. Coming into it.
So you'd like me to introduce myself?
Yes.
Okay.
Tell us about you.
Hello, everybody. I'm Paola Totaro. I'm actually a journalist by profession. I'm Italian born. I grew up in Australia, and I've been in London working as a journalist since 2008, when I was posted here to cover Europe. And my book was born, which is here, which is a rather pretty cover, I have to say, was born of a magazine feature, because on March 27, 2020, I went to the bathroom and washed my hands, as we're all told. London or the UK had been in lockdown for 7 days or so. We'd been told to wash our hands a gazillion times, as we all know. And I went to use this beautiful hand cream, which has sort of cedar atlas in it, very strong perfumes, and I love it, and I could smell nothing. And so, as so many of you probably had the same experience, I scrabbled in my perfume cupboard to try and sniff things, nothing. And in the end, I went and found the toilet bleach, put my nose in it, and there was absolutely nothing. And so I understood immediately that something was terribly wrong. And because I'd been covering COVID in Italy in those early days, and I'd started hearing anecdotal reports of this mysterious loss of smell, sudden loss of smell, I was intrigued and panicked, I have to say. And at the end of that year, when I'd gone on this journey for a magazine feature to write about what had happened globally, I realized that there was just way more to write about than just 3,000 words for a magazine. And so the book was born. And so I spent 2021 interviewing scientists all over the world. I spent a week with Thomas Hummel in Dresden, did lots of things, but I won't go on anymore. Anyway, it was born of the experience, basically.
Born of that experience. And I'm just curious to know, we'll get into your research as well, and that extraordinary year of research. And I'm still amazed that, that was needed, that our sense of smell, we've only got five major senses, and the fact that one of them had such a gap in place is, it's why we're here. And I think your book is such a fantastic contribution to this as well. Let's take us back a bit though, and what has your sense of smell meant to you in your life?
Well, it's something I thought long and hard about when I started to write this book, because I realized that I've been a foreign correspondent, so I've traveled the world covering very strange things. I spent a week with the Italian Coast Guards before the Arab Spring, between the waters of Lampedusa, the little island, and Libya, which is the sort of the entry point of North African migrants into Italy. And I remember, writing a feature after this terrible experience of mid-sea rescues, and the first thing that I wrote was the stench of fear, as people who were being saved in this incredibly terrible storm, and the boat was going down. I went to Nepal, and I trekked through the Himalayas with an ophthalmic surgeon who did lens replacement, cataract replacement operations in very remote villages. And I look back at this feature, and I'd written about the smell of this lidocaine that went into the eyes. I obviously am very smell driven. I walk the dog and I smell roses. Clearly it's been very much part of my life. And when it went, it was shocking.
But tell us about that moment of shock. I mean, what came up for you in that time?
Well, the day it happened, I remember that I felt in my stomach when I realized it was completely gone. And I would later learn that the bleach thing was the trigeminal nerve. So really the damage was clearly, in retrospect, long. And it took, 18 months to 2 years for me to get it back. But I didn't know that at the time. But it was like a vacuum. It was absolutely, there was nothing. I felt like I was in a bubble. Yeah. And when I realized it was gone, it felt like being in I can only describe it. I think I described described it in the book as it being in an elevator where they cut the cord. It was just like literally falling and not having no sense of something had gone, put it that way.
And that's interesting because I really get and relate to it the first time that I really put myself to articulate what losing a lot of my sense of smell was like. I talked about sort of that if I can't have the world inside me as it comes into me, it's like being on the other side of a pane of glass or inside that bubble that you talk about. It lasted a really long time for you as well. 18 months is a long time to be hoping for recovering, especially at that time, the beginning of COVID, of course. There was very little or if any knowledge about what this was and why it was getting triggered.
Well, I mean, I think that was the hardest part because it was so early and we knew so little. And I suppose in some ways I was very lucky because as a journalist, I was able to get access to people like Professor Bob Datter, who is at Harvard, and he was the scientist that actually told us first what COVID was doing to the nose, and that it was the scaffoldings, the sustentacular cells, not the receptors. So I was constantly being educated, but it was a long time, and of course I was learning more and more as I went on this journey, but there was no guarantees. And there was just absolutely no knowledge of what could happen in the long term. And the longer it went, the more dejected I became. But I got an inkling of a smell around the 7th or 8th month, and that's when I felt a little bit of hope.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
But there was an experience out there again. We got Michelle in the chat box saying 17 months. And with that, an invitation to everybody, if there's something that Paola says that triggers a thought for you, you want to share your own experiences, please do pop your thoughts into the chat box. We'll open up a space in the end for a Q&A for any thoughts or ideas or anything you'd like to share. It's like Michelle is doing anosmia and parosmia. Thank you, Michelle. Or is that Michele? I'm sorry, I don't know which one it is. I haven't got my glasses on, so I can't see your photo in there.
It's Michelle, I think.
It is Michelle.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe pronounced Michele, who knows?
So, and then you went out, I mean, sort of interesting. So you said you had access to a lot of these people and of course your professional knowledge about how to get in touch with them, how to research, how to approach people, how to get in touch. But I imagine there was an initial moment where you sat down and thought, right, let me go and find out what people know about this. And my guess is you didn't find much.
Well, I suppose when I was researching the magazine feature, and during that year before the idea for the book came, I started to read a lot. And in fact, you might see behind, I've got a whole collection of books on smell. But actually, that's probably all of them. And that's not really very many when you think about it. Because if you'd probably have a library 10 times the size if you were looking at books on vision or hearing. So by the time I started to write the book, I'd read a fair bit, and you're absolutely right. There really just isn't terribly much. There's probably more there's less for the layperson, less for the person like me that needed to understand everything from the bottom up. There's a lot more in sort of the philosophy and perception area, the chemosensory area. But for the person like me that really needed to learn from it instead of the building blocks, there wasn't much. And I hope that's where this book will sort of
find a space in between. Yeah,
I hope.
Because there is also that translation. And as I said, I mean, the time I first spoke was at the first Fifth Sense conference. That's when Duncan and I first made contact, and he invited me on to speak. And I was like, I need to put something in words that I've never done before, and that I've never read anybody else do either. So it's more than just, isn't it, the sort of the scientific text, or you said the chemosensory pieces, but there is also that sense of, philosophy doing what it's best of translating these into real human experiences that we can articulate to other people and to ourselves as well.
I really hope that's what I did, because I think you'll find, if people read the book, that there are the voices of people who are describing their experience incredibly eloquently. There's a professor of philosophy in Spain who talked about congenital anosmia and what existence is like when you've never had the sense. There's people that have talked about it having lost it traumatically through brain injury. There's people like David Hare, the playwright here in the UK, who got parosmia. He was one of the most unusual cases. He got parosmia, but not anosmia. So he was suddenly, in the very early days, probably a week after me, was suddenly struck by tap water tasting like sewage. And this is way before the big wave of parosmia, where we now understand what's happening. So hopefully, as you say, the book gives voice to people's experience and makes other people feel less alone, I suppose, on the journey of living without your fifth sense.
Because it is a very solitary world otherwise, isn't it?
It certainly can be. It's no fun when everybody's going, oh God, this gin tastes wonderful, and you're going, it's very annoying.
And how was it sort of describing this to other people?
Describing the experience of anosmia
to things like friends and family. And
I look, in the beginning, I think just people didn't get it at all, and in fact I think it was interesting because a number of friends lost their sense of smell sort of in the months that followed, in the waves that followed, and quite a few came back to me and said, I'm so sorry that I didn't take it more seriously, because I don't think people understand until it happens to them. You really don't know what you've lost until you've lost it.
No, spot on.
Yeah.
And that's also partly what Fifth Sense has been doing for many years, and I don't think it's necessary. When Duncan founded Fifth Sense, it was very much to support people with loss, and I think it became clear quite soon in, Duncan, do correct me in chat, sorry, I've got you on mute as well. I think you can unmute yourself. But actually educating people what Fifth Sense, what smell is and what it means and how it connects to our sense of self and sense of identity and how we sort of navigate in the world is a piece of education that we've had to get out and do alongside, the support work as well.
Yeah.
So.
I think organizations that allow people like Fifth Sense and Absent, those organizations that allow people not to feel alone and to share the experience is just so important. And clearly that's happened all over the world as this wave of this pandemic of anosmia swept the globe.
And there's still people, there are many people out there still. I mean, I had a chat to somebody today who said, oh, my friend's got anosmia. And I said, oh, Fifth Sense, come and find out. And, came along. My neighbour there is just over that side, has had anosmia for more than 12 months, but she just doesn't really want to engage with it. She's just sort of gone into a kind of,
it's interesting.
Sort of cut off from it,
people do respond differently, and not everybody mourns it in the way that that I did, or obviously you did. Not everybody does. That's the reality. But for those that do, it's a grief, isn't it?
Totally. Thank you. Just a few comments coming in. 15 years. No idea why. That was Ken. Lynn saying, totally understand the way you felt. 14 years from Amanda. Probably a virus, but not sure. Because of course some of the viruses, but non-COVID viruses could just sort of hit, but not give many other symptoms, perhaps more than just the mildest cold you wouldn't even notice. Michelle is meningioma removed. Precious saying, people didn't get it for me, I stopped attending social events. I really get that. Was that something you experienced, Paola, at all? Did you find yourself withdrawing from certain parts of the world or life?
Actually, it was lockdown for me.
So, yeah.
So, I mean, in many ways, the book sort of provided a focus for me and a lifeline, really, because I was dealing with lots of people via Zoom, and lots of the scientists that I interviewed before we were able to get out and about, I did through Zoom. So no, not really. But I can absolutely understand that had I been in normal times and I'd lost my sense of smell, to go to a party, to go to a dinner party, a restaurant, to have a drink with friends or a walk, it would, I can totally understand that you just go, oh, it's no fun, really.
Yeah. And that's the depth of the impact. It's hard to get across to
Yeah.
people. So there we are. We sort of noticed about the first period of it. You're getting out and finding there was a lack to go. Tell us about then I'm going to use the word journey. Apologies. Your journey through the research, through the meetings, through the understanding that you gained.
Well, do you know, I think that the most extraordinary thing for me was, and maybe it was extraordinary times because everybody was locked down and the scientists all over the world were also out of their laboratories and probably going mad. But as you all know, the GCCR, this group of scientists got together very early. They coalesced, they set aside their normal, probably, competitive nature and got together to try and to work in a collegiate way to find out what the hell was going on with this mysterious virus. And so I was really lucky that I Zoomed with people in Monell, with Bob Datter in Harvard. Thomas Hummel spent lots of time with me talking. I ended up last August at Dresden, and I did a week with his students. It was the most fascinating week in an anatomy laboratory, really understanding the ins and outs of the olfactory system with ENT students. I went up to Reading, University of Reading, and was tested on a GFC to sort of see what smells might be slightly distorted. I mean, I had a baptism of fire in olfactory science, and loved every second of it. I'm very grateful. Also, that as a journalist, I've been a journalist for 30 years, so I'm trained to take on quite complex subjects and to try and make them entertaining and engaging and factually obviously correct. So I was well trained for it, I guess. To do
certainly were. I mean, if you're going to pick the global highlights of people who are working in this area, you certainly go right in there. And again, I imagine that you sort of started on that quest not quite realising how far you'd have to go in it. So what are some of the key pieces that you learned along the way which has sort of helped you understand the condition and that maybe also helped you... No, I'm asking closed questions. What are some things you found out on the way?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that you did that early, the graphic, because I don't think I understood when it happened to me before I started to research. I didn't really understand the importance of retronasal olfaction to the perception of flavour. I mean, I had always just assumed that your tongue did all the work, and the nuance of flavour, the zest of citrus, the difference between an orange zest and a lemon zest. These are all really sophisticated things that our nose does for us, and it's not just it's just not the tongue. So understanding that part of the olfactory system was fascinating. I didn't have any idea about the trigeminal nerve and its importance and role within the olfactory system. I also, as a writer, funnily enough, prior to doing this book, I was actually researching a book. When I lost my sense of smell, I was actually researching a book about a perfumer, a French perfumer in the 1830s in Naples. So I was in the thick of writing about smells. And so, learning about the history and cultural aspects of smell over the ages and the changes in the way science and medicine in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries changed, and theories of miasma and the smells brought disease, and all these things were completely new to me. I mean, fascinating, but I had no idea. Absolutely no idea.
And what did you learn about the condition? Oh, sorry. If I could just do a quick rewind. Again, it's just, I don't want to assume everybody knows what it is, but trigeminal nerve, just give us your quick summary on that.
So we all know that a good example is when I put my nose in the bottle of bleach, and everybody will know that ammonia smell, that if you put your nose in it, you just draw back and it's it's a horrible sort of irritant. So the trigeminal nerve is incredibly important because it alerts us to, it basically reacts to irritants like chili, raw onion, powerful smells like ammonias. It's effectively a sentinel for irritants, if you like. And it's directly connected with our olfactory system and is incredibly important for the perception of those things that we regard as spicy hot. It's important to temperature. It's important as, as a sentinel for danger, I suppose. So, I had no idea about that either. It was all very new.
Thank you. I always wonder whether smoke's related to it, because whatever level my smell is at, smoke is something I can smell spot on. It's completely unimpacted.
Actually, that's interesting. And I suspect that there would be an irritant in smoke that would affect the trigeminal nerve.
So, and then what did you find out about the condition? Because I heard you referring to some of the things you learned when you did your Today interview as well.
The condition, sorry.
But you were talking about where it is that the damage came, and very specifically looking at your own condition.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, that was that was one of the most exciting things that I got to speak to Professor Bob Datta, Sandeep Robert Datta, who's a neuroscientist who works at Harvard, and he and his students, they were locked out of their laboratories, but they did a massive data dive. And in doing so, were the first to identify the fact that COVID virus affects the sustentacular cells, which are pretty much the scaffolding cells that hold together the system of neurons and receptors in the top of our nose. And so the way he described it to me, I found fascinating. And that was that effectively, it's a bit like having a keyboard, and you throw it on the ground and you've got all the letter keys, but they're not working together. And so this scaffolding is destroyed by COVID, and then there's an inflammatory response that with some people ends up lasting a long time. And that's why we end up with we end up with anosmia, but we also end up with these parosmias and these terrible distortions. I don't know about you, but I didn't get the ugly parosmia. I was kind of lucky. I didn't get the sewage smells, but everything that was foul smelled fair. In other words, all the bathroom smells were like sweet potato and biscuits to me. So it was entirely distorted, but in another way. And so that was kind of explained that these connections had been damaged by the virus and needed to regenerate. And then we needed to train to train our sense of smell to try and help the recognition factor and help the process of nerve to brain.
Got it. Thank you. Just pick up a few comments. Leo Rez, yes, don't worry. I'm sort of going through towards the recovery that Paola had, and some of the ideas that she got from her research as well. I'm sort of taking it step by step. Michele, saying onions, the worst for parosmia. That's quite a common one that we've heard as well. Interesting, Michelle's wrote this, and I'm curious to know this, in that 18 months without smell for you. Michelle says this: I find the loss of smell and taste is difficult to manage my diet and stress about eating or drinking something that might be off. So what was your experience of that through this time?
It's funny because I actually, in the book, I asked my husband and co-author to take over and wrote a chapter, and he also spoke to the husbands of two other anosmic people, not post-COVID, and basically I had to rely on other people. So if I was unsure of something, I would just ask my husband to smell it. Now he laughed because his sense of smell was nothing like mine. I could tell when the kids had a cigarette, or, I was like radar. Nobody could get past me. And all of a sudden he had to become the family nose. So milk would go to him, meat. Tested everything on him, poor thing.
Got it. Thank you. Because we do find that some people, Fifth Sense members or people come through and as part of our discussion, some people find eating very difficult and pull back from it. And some people can then or be searching for the experience of some kind of, I want a connected experience to my food, and can then eat more or cycle somewhere in between the two.
Yeah.
And for people with parosmia, then just the restricting down of foods in order to find something that's okay and palatable can be a real issue as well.
I mean, that's the good thing about this period, if there's any silver lining to this horrible COVID, is the fact that there is now, so much more interesting research about the molecular basis of parosmia, the kind of foods that you should probably avoid. Everybody here may know this, but, best to stay to non-cooked foods or to let your food cool down. There's lots and lots of things that now you can take on and try and get you through this very, very difficult period of recovery.
Absolutely. And we're trying to build up resources as we go, and we do actually have, if people do have parosmia and haven't come along to one of our sessions, we're running one. Duncan, I'm sure you'll be able to put the date in the next couple of weeks. So it's a parosmia only session, and we give chance for people to swap tips like that to see what they can do. But I mean, something that really came out, I think, on our first or second session, that nutrition is key, that people could be eating enough but actually be in a state of malnutrition, because it's just living off bread and cheese, for example. Which is a real key.
That's something I didn't know about parosmia, that it's these distortions are very common with people that are having chemotherapy and radiotherapy. So there's a whole cohort of patients who have smell dysfunction, but there was so little for them, because it was just assumed that they just had to get on with it and they had bigger things to worry about, i.e. a cancer. So again, maybe there's a silver lining in that there's more resource out there to help people in other situations for smell dysfunction too.
Absolutely. Thank you. A couple of comments. Ken saying, I try to search for stronger flavoured foods, see if I can get anything. Absolutely. Parosmia network, virtue, taste and smell, textures being interested as well. How was that for you? I mean, that's something as well that we talk about, is trying to get crunch in, trying to get spice in, trying to, work around with the salt, sweet, sour balances. Did you?
Yeah, texture was hugely important. Anything that I could mix in that gave me a crunch, or anything that, within smoother things. I mean, this is probably not a great thing to mention, but I really like a gin and tonic as an aperitif before dinner, and I couldn't taste it, so I added Campari, which was bitter. So at least I had the sense, I had that bitter taste, which gave me a bit of a connection to the aperitif that I was having. So there's lots of little hints. They don't all help, but it's always worth experimenting and seeing what you can tolerate.
Absolutely. I'm not drinking alcohol at the moment, and I found my wife came home with a non-alcoholic Campari just a couple of days ago, and what
was it like?
Very good.
Yeah.
Actually,
so you got the bitter. Oh, I must.
You get the real bitter, and it's got a nice piece of sweetness in, but not too much, like the original as well. So
Harry was my friend.
Find these things. Just lastly, before we sort of have a quick chat about sort of the road towards recovery, both the sort of the mental and also the physical side, I guess, on this as well. But one other issue that can come up quite a lot for FISETS members, and is a focus for us as an organisation, is safety. And we've had people who've nearly burnt their house down, or find their coat was on fire and they didn't realise it, or Duncan, FISETS founder, was seconds away from blowing himself up from a gas leak in his flat. And it's a difficult state to be in, because we can't smell anything. Our brain is something there, and it can be almost like a constant state of alert. Just curious to know of any experiences you had around sort of safety or concerns around safety.
Well, I mean, it's funny you mentioned that, because I had both. I set fire to a tea towel, and I had no idea. There was just the tea towel was on the gas flame, and I had my back to it, and I was cutting something, and it was billowing smoke, and I had no idea. But then when the distortions came in, I had a long period, 6 to 8 weeks, where all I could smell was smoke. It was like a smell lock, and it was constant. And I drove my family nuts for the first few weeks until I realized that it was a smell lock, because I kept saying, because we live in a terrace, and I kept saying, oh my God, there's something burning, there's something burning. So they'd have to go and check and reassure me. So yeah, I know those things very well. Awful, awful, awful.
My goodness.
I just have to laugh that somebody had extra gin. Hello, Lynn.
Another way to get there. Thank you. Michelle said, I've just returned to work and I have a risk assessment stating I cannot be in the building on my own due to no sense of smell. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because we work with Cadent, who supply gas. Well, they manage the gas infrastructure of a lot of the UK. And we've had discussions with them about gas, is that gas smells because the smell is put into it. Natural gas by itself has no odour at all. A smell is put into it as an alarm. And it's the olfactory equivalent of a flashing light, which is a visual alarm, or a siren, which is an audible alarm. Gas has this smell alarm in it.
Yeah.
And it was just sort of suddenly going, of course, that's the mechanism. And if you can't smell,
what do you do?
It's like not being able to see, and you have being blind and having a flashing light to tell you that something's wrong. So.
Yeah.
So on the road to recovery, so you said it was around the point of interesting. What did you do to help you on the way? I mean, somebody's put a question in around smell training. Is that something that I think that's something you mentioned that you tried?
Yeah, it's funny because I did it religiously out of instinct. I have a collection of perfumes. I love them. I have one in particular that I love, and every day, probably, I don't think I was smell training at the time. I was just desperately sniffing to see if I could get anything. So, but then obviously much later, I learned about smell training. I'd made contact with Thomas Hommel, who's one of the first many years ago to test this on his patients. Absent, there's lots of sort of work around encouraging people to do this in a more what would you call it, disciplined way to try to mindfully smell 3 or 4 smells twice a day, same time of the day if you can, and to really try and remember the smells and push through even if you can't remember. And I did that, I think, out of instinct, and then did it when I learned that there's evidence to show that it can help and does help. So I still do that. And the more I learn, the more it's important that we do it as you get older, because we lose our sense of smell as we get older. And in actual fact, there's lots of sort of interesting research with the elderly that smell training should be part of sort of, it's like a bit like exercise. You should really keep doing it. Yeah,
but there's lots of little studies. I've sort of read riding a bike is good because it keeps the balance going, or learning a language is good because it keeps language
exactly.
going. I never thought of that one. Sorry, excuse me.
Yeah, no, it's really important.
I mean, it's a hard one to connect into because, of course, there can be a recovery. But do you feel that the sense of the smell training had a real impact for you?
I think it did. But as far as I am concerned, I smell pretty much everything normally. What's really interesting for me is that I can be in the house and there can be a smell, and if I don't have a visual clue, I smell the smell. I know it's familiar, but I don't immediately recognize it. So, in the past, if I smelled onions frying, I would know immediately it was onions frying. Still now, I can smell things that I know are familiar and I won't know until I go and find out or ask. So that sort of work of connection, of getting that network between the olfactory bulb and the brain working, I think that's where smell training continues to work, even for me and for people that are recovered. But I think it's really worth continuing with.
And so you still feel it sounds as though you're in the recovery period now.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, to be in the house and to smell something, and that there's something in the air, but you don't know what it is. it's quite discombobulating. I find it still quite disturbing. You know, I mean, generally most things I'll recognize, but if it's floating up and there's no obvious, you know, I'm not sure that my husband's cooking or my daughter's had a shower and is yet, the fact that I can't immediately pinpoint what it is off.
A sign that there's something.
Yeah, it's not quite right. Yeah.
So I'd be curious to know about the sort of mental side as well, because somebody said about the sort of ups and downs, and I know that there have been periods where I sort of get quite obsessive and watch just to see, and I've had a lot of operations to try and you know, to improve my sense of smell, and every time it's like, maybe this time is going to be the one. It can be such a big sort of up and down of hope and perhaps despair, and in this case for you it did turn out right in the end, but it does sound like it was a very long time.
It really was. And also, I think that most people that have had a COVID-related or a viral-related anosmia will know that experience where you can feel like things are back to normal. And then the next day, it's like one step forward and three steps back. You can never be sure, because the recovery process and the way the regeneration of all these structures occurs, it really is unpredictable, and it is not a linear recovery. And it's really important not to get dejected and just to keep trying and trying and trying and try to keep. I mean, I used to laugh about trying to be Tigger rather than Eeyore, because sometimes it's much easier to be Eeyore, isn't it, really?
Oh, yes.
So, yeah, I had to get the old Tigger out. That was my morning sort of reminder.
Thank you. And so it was around 7 months you first got something, but then you were saying it was around 18 months before you felt that you were at a point where you recovered.
18 months, 2 years, to be honest. I mean, it's now, so it was March 27, 2020, and February, March, it was 2 years. So it's still not quite right, but I can smell, and that's the most important thing, really.
Fantastic.
For me.
So just looking forward before we sort of open up a little bit for a Q&A, what's your hope for this book as to what it will do?
Well, I hope that people read it, and not just people who've lost their sense of smell, but people generally. I've written it in a way I hope that I take you on the journey with me. And we go into the laboratories of the scientists, and we talk to the philosophers, and we talk to people that have lost their sense of smell or were born without it. We look back in history. We look at poets. For example, we were talking earlier about Wordsworth, who the most famous of the Romantic poets, who wrote about nature, and yet he had no sense of smell. We look at the great stink in London and how laws changed, and planning laws in cities the world over were pretty much dictated by smell, because we had to separate stinky industry from the way people lived. I think I hope that it's an education about the sense of smell, and that it revalues it and puts it back into the public spotlight and makes people understand how important it is, and that we really shouldn't dismiss it the way we have for an awfully long time. That's my hope.
Thank you. I'm a bit speechless about that, because I think that it's, certainly when I first lost my sense of smell, it was just a kind of from the medical industry, and sometimes I couldn't even get to the end of a sentence with friends talking about it. But in the last sort of 7 or 8 years, I've been interviewed by Guardian journalists. I've been, and had public platforms, and had a real sort of privilege to be able to be here and facilitate these sessions with hundreds and hundreds of conversations in between us all. It's come a long way, but it's still got a long way to go, hasn't it? I think that's what all of that is coming to.
Yep, I think you're right. But hopefully, yes, as I say, if there's a silver lining to this global pandemic, hopefully this unique period in medical and scientific history will help do exactly what you're trying to do and what Duncan's been trying to do.
Where do you see the future for the medical sort of approaches to this?
I'm hoping that that there is a greater understanding now that it is a sentinel for health, and that if somebody goes to the doctor and says my sense of smell is gone, instead of being told to never mind, that it leads to certain tests. Apart from viral and trauma-related injuries, that take your sense of smell, it can also be a sentinel for neurological diseases. And neurological diseases that are quite serious. But if, for example, like Parkinson's, if you're medicated early on, you have a much better outcome and a much better and longer quality of life. I mean, I spoke to a Parkinson's expert in Germany, and she had a patient, twin patients. And one patient decided, they both had loss of sense of smell very early before the symptoms of Parkinson's. One decided to medicate and take medication for Parkinson's, the other one didn't. So basically, the one that did take medication after losing their sense of smell is much, much better off, much fewer symptoms, much better quality of life. And it was the sense of smell that alerted that specialist to the fact that, that's what it might be. So there are all sorts of good reasons to treat your sense of smell with respect. And I hope that the GPs and doctors who are not ENT specialists, but who are sort of general frontline health, start to take it more seriously.
Thank you. So let's open up a few questions. We've got a few in the chat box. If you have a question you'd like to put to Paola, then if you could find your reaction button and click on, there's only one button which will work, and that's the raise hand button. If you put anything else up, it'll disappear after a few seconds. But I've also got a few here in the chat box. Leorez, I get you've been answering a question, Leorez, and I sort of get underneath it that are real wanting to know. So Leorez, a nice question, which was the fact that, where was it gone? What was the main reason you think you were able to get your sense of smell back?
I don't think anybody could answer that. I suspect that it's a mix of lucky physiology, and that there now seems to be a lot of work that there is a genetic component to those that recover better or don't get as sick from COVID. I had apart from anosmia, that's all I had from COVID. So perhaps I'm part of that cohort that is genetically a bit stronger against this virus, and it attacked me in those front. I can't honestly. I don't think science has an answer to that, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
I'd love to give you an answer, but I don't think there is one.
I think there are things we can try, such as the smell training.
Yep.
Chris saying, should we see a doctor? I haven't, and I've yet to start smell training. I need help with how to get started, please. 10 months since I lost sense of taste and smell. What was your first point into discussing it with medical profession?
Are you asking me?
Yeah, sorry, Paola, yeah.
Oh, well, I mean, when it happened to me, I rang the GP, and they didn't even associate it with COVID.
Right.
They just said, no, don't worry, there's no evidence. And just the fact that I'd been reporting it, I isolated anyway, but there was absolutely no help at all. None. The first thing I did ultimately was, after I was, I'd done the work for the magazine feature, was I read about smell training, and I did it properly. So I got the 4 essential oils, the one for trigeminal, eucalyptus. I think I got a rose, a citrus, and maybe a clove, things that were all familiar to me. And I just started to use them religiously, as well as my perfumes.
Yeah. Thank you. For resources on that, do have a look on our webpage. I think Duncan put it in earlier. We also have Frauke on the call here today, who runs those sessions. And you picked up mindfulness, that being a really important part of that, almost like a ritual of every day, twice a day, taking time to do it. And it's also about managing the frustration since then as well, because I know a lot of people sort of stick a pot of very potent essential oils on their nose and breathe in very, very deeply and try and search for the smell, but that's not what it's about. We're not forcing it here. It's about a gentle piece by piece by piece opening up, and hopefully helping reforming the connection at that point. And
trying to remember, the really trying to get your mind as you've put your nose in that little bottle of citrus or lemon or whatever it is that you like, to try and close your eyes and think about how that smell felt and what it reminded you of and where you were when you smelled it. These are all parts of the connections, you know. The smell is so deeply associated with memory that you have to exercise the two things together.
The memory piece is very important for a lot of people. We have a perfumer called Sarah McCartney who does these sessions, and she made this very beautiful point, is the fact that if we are unable to smell, and there are people with anosmia, which, you know, for head trauma, for example, it looks like the long-term future is the fact that there isn't a recovery. So at that point, we need to focus on saying, well, how do we continue to live a rich life? And really put our focus on that part of it instead. And one of the bits that she really brought up was to say that the link in between smell and memory is so strong that we can end up feeling like we can't access a lot of the memories we would have accessed day to day. And so one of the techniques she talked about is, say you pick up an orange, just first, before sort of breaking into it, is just thinking, what's the first memory that comes up? And it's almost like to force the act of remembering into that. Because it won't necessarily come through the nose, it won't come through the sense of smell, but it doesn't mean that we have to cut off so many parts of our life as a result.
Yeah. Well, actually, you know, in one of there's one part of the book where I spoke to an Australian researcher who's doing some work and is continuing to do it now after COVID. And they were looking at people with traumatic brain injury and anosmia, and looking at how the brain responds to memories of smell. And the reality is that the brain lights up. With the memory of a smell, there are parts of the brain that can be seen to be stimulated. So just as some people with stroke can retrain their brains to compensate for loss of movement or parts of speech, it looks like we're getting some very interesting evidence. It's early days yet, that the role of memory in smell and trying to regain it, or at least get some sense of it back, could be very important. So yeah, I'm really interested to go back to him at some point in the next year or so, and once his laboratory is completely reopened, to see how they go with that. So never lose hope.
Thank you very much. Moira, can Paola explain how her flavour returned, please? Did some foods come back sooner than others, and was flavour behind smell? Moira, I'm not sure if you missed a little bit at the beginning that I just covered off how those interact together, but did flavour come back in the same as smell?
Well, as you showed so clearly on that graphic, they are flavour is entirely reliant on retronasal olfaction. So when you have no smell, you have sweet, sour, umami, bitter, and the fifth one, I can't remember what it is now. Whereas that nuance of flavour, it comes from your nose. So basically, yes, it was a bit like getting my smell back. It was exactly the same. There were some things that I simply did not perceive in the same way that I perceived others. I can't really pinpoint, to be honest. I know onions took a long time, which is really strange, but maybe that's related to the trigeminal nerve. But yeah, some things came back quicker than others. I'm pretty sure of that looking back. It's funny how you forget, isn't it?
Oh, I can imagine. I'm sort of a type as well. I sort of forget illnesses and times, and yes, I imagine I would as well. Paola, thank you very much indeed. I've just noticed we're coming up to the hour. Chris, I have almost daily flapjack. Yeah, I totally get it. Those things that you find that really give you that sense of satisfaction and connection back to your food again, very important. 400 calories is a tough one to connect to. Paola, thank you so much. We wish you all the best with your book. Your mission, your idea for what it is needed, for the gap that's there, is very, very much what we've done as a charity as well. I think your book is important and needed out in the world for everybody indeed. So I really hope all the best with it as it goes along. We've got a link, I think, that Duncan's going to pop in for people if they want to buy it. Paola, you're saying that Amazon has, for some reason, gone out of stock, which is a pain.
They're out of stock, but there's lots of other booksellers. Hopefully they'll replenish soon, and hopefully they're in your local bookshop. And And we're hoping also that if you're in America, there's a small publisher in New York that appears to be interested, and so hopefully we'll get it out there on demands in the next 4 or 5 weeks, because I know that in America there's a huge problem too. So fingers crossed. But thank you so much for your support. So thank you.
Thank you all very much
for having me.